In our last session, you heard Dr. Carson deal with a major theme in biblical theology, namely temple and priest. What we're going to do next is take you into my own study and look at Job 42 and see a demonstration of how those themes emerge from the text and how you make use of them in your preaching. How do you preach from Old Testament narrative? We're introducing pastors, some of them for the first time, to an idea called biblical theology. That's just a discipline of study, the definition of which, biblical theology's conviction is that the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the unifying, interpretive center of the whole Bible. So that wherever you're coming into the Bible from, the death and resurrection of Jesus is the center of gravity that actually holds this whole thing together. Now, what does that mean then when you're actually in an Old Testament text? How does one think about preaching the gospel from the Old Testament? Let me just give you a little drawing here. If this is a timeline and you have an ancient text here, that's an Old Testament text, and you have the work of Christ here at a time in history, and you and I live here, and let's say he's going to return here, the question for us is continually, how does this text actually find its fulfillment in this work? And how can we do that in a way that speaks to this people who live here? So what I want to do tonight is demonstrate for you what goes on in a pastor's study. So some of you are pastors, others of you are key church leaders. Some of you might wonder, well, how does it really happen? How do you get from these texts, say in 1 Samuel, and actually emerge with a sermon that somehow makes a rightful connection to the work of the gospel? What happens? And so I just want to do that for you. If I was to put it kind of in another picture way in regard to what that might look like, think of it like this. You start with a text here, and you know in your study that that text takes you back to a people from a long time ago. It takes you back then, and it takes you to them. And there's a lot of things you've got to do to understand what did this text mean to them at that time. But then there's another leg of the journey, and this is the leg of the journey we're looking at tonight. How do you move from there to the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ? And how do you do so in a right way rather than in an arbitrary way? How do you do so the way that the Word itself would like you to do so? Long before you begin your preparation and your study to figure out, how do I now bring this text to my people today? That's the journey that pastors are making every week. Coming to grips with a text in its context, its ancient context, and then pausing and having to consider and reflect. This is the task of biblical theology then, to reflect on how this text is influenced, or how am I to understand it in light of the gospel? And that's the work that we do. So tonight, I just want to do that. Just pretend that we're all in the middle of the week. Pretend that you're the one preaching next Sunday, and somebody's giving you a text, and here it is, Job 42, 7 to 17. And we're going to look especially at how one can move from this ancient text to the work of the gospel in a way that would enhance my understanding of the text and enrich the lives of the people listening through the lens of a particular theme that might emerge in it. All right, so you ready? You all ready to preach next Sunday? Let's take a look, Job 42, 7 to 17. I'll go ahead and read it. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, "My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. So Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did what the Lord had told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then came to him all his brothers and sisters and all who had known him before, and ate bread with him in his house, and they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. And the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. And he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, and 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he called the name of his first daughter Jemimah, and the name of his second Keziah, and the name of the third Keren Hapuk. And in all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters. And their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. And after this, Job lived 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons 4 generations. And Job died an old man and full of days. Your task, to sit in your study, come to an understanding of this text, authentically integrate it to the work of the gospel in a way that enhances your understanding of the text and enriches the lives of your people. First thing I do in the study with a text like this is notice what kind of genre it is, or what am I actually studying? Am I studying a letter? I mean, you wouldn't read a legal brief the way you would read a bedtime story, and you wouldn't read a poem the way you would read the newspaper. And in the Bible, you have all kinds of different types of literature, but the literature before us here, I notice, surprisingly, is narrative. It's surprising because the entire book of Job, if you just thumb your fingers back through the pages, is poetry. Until you get all the way back to the beginning, when Job has that great crisis, and he ends up on the ash heap, and he's introduced, or we are introduced, to his 3 friends. So here's Job, a massively long book, the bookends of which are narrative, and the message of which comes in poetic form. So, we look at the text and we need to see some structure. We'll need to ask ourselves, how is this story organized? Because however it's organized, I should be submitting my message this week to its shape and be in line with its structure. So if you had to do that, talk to the person next to you just for a moment and tell them how many parts or points, divisions, you think there are in this text, because that will probably indicate how many points or divisions you're going to end up putting in your message on Sunday. I'll just give you 30 seconds. Just talk to the guy next to you. Hey, this week is going to be a 3-point message, or it's going to be 5 points, or 1. But submit your thought to the narrative itself. All right. How many parts? What's the natural division this week?
We're thinking 2 parts.
Yeah, I think 2 is good too. Where would you break it? What are the verse breaks?
7 through 9.
Yep. And then 10 to the end. I felt the same way. And one of the things that every working pastor does is first try to determine the structure of what's in front of them and then submit their message to it. So for me, when I looked at this, 7 to 10, I called the vindication of Job. It seemed obvious to me that after this long haul of being on the ash heap, what happens at a content level when you dig down into those verses is that guy was totally vindicated. I mean, all the words that those guys had poured out on him, they had to take back. The vindication of Job. When I looked at the second half, I began to think about what that really might be saying in distinction from the first half, and I simply called it the exaltation of Job, or in one sense, the restoration, right, of all the things that have been taken from him in the beginning. So automatically, once I get to work in the text, and it might take a while to get that far, but I felt pretty cleanly that this week's message, we're finishing a book that deals with the humiliation of Job. But by the end, we've arrived at a brief moment where we see God has vindicated him, and indeed, God has exalted him. All those things that happen on the back half, he's restored to a place of honor above others. He's blessed materially beyond measure. Wonderful things that happen there. On the front half, this is the interesting moment, and it moves us to the real subject of what we're trying to do tonight, and that's to ask ourselves how biblical theology can rightly be done here for my sermon preparation. I put it this way, verse 7, Job is vindicated by God. But verse 8 and 9, God declares that these three will be vindicated through Job. I began to look at that a bit, and I felt like when we actually go from text to them and then, we felt we have a pretty good idea of what's happening. But now, biblical theology, a belief that the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the unifying interpretive center of all Scripture. How does one move from this text in that structure to the gospel in a decent way? One of the ways that pastors put into practice every week is to ask a couple of simple questions. Let me give you one of them. Are there any major themes, biblical, theological themes, that run through the Bible that by concept or by language or by function emerge in the text that I'm looking at? Let me give you an example of a theme. A theme might be king. You see it occur early in Genesis 17 where God promises a king will emerge from Abraham. You see the movement in the middle of 1 Samuel as it shifts from the time of the judges to the kings. You see kings that actually typify a later king that will rule his people. You see Jesus, who becomes the King of Kings. It is a theme that runs until it grabs hold of Jesus as its interpretive center. Can you think of a few other kinds of themes in the Bible that are big? Let's just list 3 or 4 of them. Suffering is a theme, and that actually falls under Israel. At one point is called God's servant or his son, and what you find throughout is that in the doctrine of sonship, the theme emerges that the servant of God or the son of God is actually a suffering one. And interestingly, that term appears in our text. Take a look. You'll see it a couple of different times. I see it, look at that little phrase, the way it speaks of Job in verse 7. Look how it defines him. As my what? My servant Job has. Or look at the same phrase again in verse 8. And my servant Job will pray for you. Does it appear again? There it is in verse 8. As my servant Job has. So Job embodies the servant of the Lord, which is a theme that we could trace. And so you might be thinking, is this worth a couple hours of preparation? as a possible way forward from my text to Jesus, who is the suffering servant. That's one idea that we could do. Let's take another one, though. Yeah.
Sin requires a sacrifice.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You mentioned sin requires a sacrifice. And so what emerges in the Hebrew Scriptures to deal with our sin and sacrifice? There's a particular office that emerges. Priesthood.
Right.
So the priesthood is another big theme. And while we don't have the office, in a sense here, of a priesthood, we have these functional connections. Can we just go ahead and list them? I think most of them appear in verses 8 and 9 and 10. In 8 and 9 and 10, there are these extraordinarily rich detail that relates to sin, sacrifice, and the theme of priesthood. Verse 8, 7 bulls, 7 rams, a burnt offering. Prayers made. The word prayer is also an intercessory role. The one who prays is fulfilling a priestly function. So there's the sacrifice made, there are prayers made, and as a consequence, what happens? The Lord would accept that prayer. So it's clear to me that we're hitting on something here that maybe is worth our time in a short session like this. Let's just take the theme priesthood, although we could have taken other themes. The question then for the working pastor is, how do I relate priesthood in this text and authentically integrate it to priesthood that we find in the gospel in a way that enhances my understanding of the text and enriches the lives of the people to whom I'm speaking? One of the ways I do it is to simply ask myself another question, and it's kind of a question that takes me back to an earlier point in the Scriptures. I don't know how much you know about Job, but it's in all likelihood the oldest book in the canon. In one sense, the material, we don't know when it all occurred, but the material, in a sense, it almost predates, Moses and everything that we think the story moves from. Job hangs as this independent story that the larger story interfaces with and is confirmed. So if we do have Job functioning here in a priestly role, where would you anchor that theme in the Old Testament in a way that would help us understand what it is that he's actually doing here? Why don't you talk to the person next to you? Try to envision one or two Old Testament texts that confirm the priestly function for the forgiveness of sins. If you get 2 or 3, then try to choose the best one. Go for it. Usually at this point in my study, again, we're just kind of pretending that we're doing this preparation ourselves. I'm usually trying to come up with a long list that I can kind of sort and prioritize so that by the time I get to Sunday, I'm taking the one that I think most closely approximates what's happening here in an enriching level. So let's come up with 3 or 4 texts. Yeah.
Exodus in 32 and 33, when Israel builds the golden calf and Moses intercedes and mediates for them.
Beautiful. Exodus 32 and 33. Moses, who's the first prophet, plays a priestly-like role long before the office. I mean, he plays this role in a number of times, doesn't he? But in Exodus 32 and 33, you have the golden calf, the anger of the Lord, the sin of the people, and the intercession of Moses. Great one. Another one.
In the Day of Atonement, there's not as much of a focus on prayer, but the role of a priest offering a sacrifice for the acceptance of God's people.
The Day of Atonement, while there isn't so much an emphasis there on what?
Prayer.
Prayer, there is an emphasis on the actual sacrifice. Well, let me ask you a tighter question. These indicate sins of people against God for which a priest mediates and atonement is granted. Our text really highlights the sins of people against Job, through which his prayers set them back right with God. You see the distinction? So, question. Before you got your lunch appointment, and your businessmen in your church are wondering what you've been doing all morning with your door closed in the office, and you're just thinking through this one question. Any Old Testament text wherein the sin that's committed is committed against the individual, and yet the individual functions in a priestly way through prayer for the atonement of the sin. Let me give you one that I was enamored by a little earlier today. Turn up Numbers 12. Miriam and Aaron oppose Moses. It begins, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us also? And the Lord heard it. Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all the people who were on the face of the earth. And suddenly the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron and to Miriam, come out, you three, to the tent of meeting. And the three of them came out. And the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forward. And he said, hear my words. If there's a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant, Moses. He's faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant, Moses? And the anger of the Lord was kindled against him, and he departed. When the cloud removed from the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous like snow. And Aaron turned toward Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. And Aaron said to Moses, O my Lord, do not punish us, because we have done foolishly and have sinned. Let her not be as one dead whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes out of his mother's womb. And Moses cried to the Lord, O God, please heal her, please. But the Lord said to Moses, if her father had but spit in her face, should she not be shamed 7 days? Let her be shut outside the camp 7 days, and after that she may be brought in again. So Miriam was shut outside the camp 7 days, and the people did not set out on the march till Miriam was brought in again. And at that the people set out from Hazeroth and camped in the wilderness of Paran. What an interesting moment. The servant of the Lord, sinned against by those who are closest to him, under the title of my servant. Interestingly, Moses is declared here as very meek, more than all the people who were on the face of the earth. And how is Job described in Job chapter 1? Anybody? There was no one like him in all the earth.
The greatest in the East.
Now that is a parallel text that anchors the idea of a priestly function that might be worth circling on. When I begin to look at this and think about your work this Sunday to preach the text, you're going to want to move from your text in an authentic way that integrates the gospel. And one way that I always would encourage you to do is to, before going to the gospel, just jumping straight from Job to the gospel, in one place, see if you can go from your text to the anchor within Israel's own history. Here we have the book of Job, which is an outlier in the whole canon. Yet it is anchored functionally to Moses in a very real, dynamic way in this particular incident. An anchor. Next question. Having looked at your text and gone back and grounded it in a priestly role, where might you go forward into the New Testament? In other words, how might Job 42, 8, and 9 and a priestly function actually be, here's the word, anticipating the gospel? See how you're working? You're working in your text two-directionally. You're anchoring it because biblical theology is a progressive unfolding, but it also is anticipating. It believes that my text finds a fulfillment in the death and resurrection of Christ through whom my atonement is made. Talk to the person next to you and do the same thing we just did. See if we can come up with a list of 4 or 5 texts that you feel Job 42, 8, and 9 might anticipate. Any New Testament control that demonstrates that what we see Job doing here in an isolated instance actually connects to what the Lord Jesus does once for all. This is the work, the weekly work. Otherwise, we're not preaching a Christian message. We're just stuck back with Job and whatever that is.
We were thinking on the cross when he said, Father, forgive them. They don't.
Take a look, Luke 23, 34. So here's Jesus on the cross in really the priestly moment where there aren't sacrifices being made. He is the sacrifice, and he is the priest, and he is the one also offering prayer. And so he is stretched out, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Wow. I don't know if you're familiar with art, but William Blake, the artist, has these etchings of Job, and one of the etchings is of this final scene, and in it you see the friends down before him, and you see his arms like this in prayer, and it is almost this, you can almost look right through it into Luke 23, 34, and see that what Job does here in an isolated moment, the Lord Jesus Christ does once for all humanity. The one sinned against is the one through whom atonement comes. What we have seen, though, in the book of Job is that the righteous man, I'm not saying he's the righteous man, but he is the righteous man. He's the emblem of the meekest man on the earth, that the righteous man does suffer. And interestingly, of all the things that his friends level against him, none of them are necessarily wrong in and of themselves, but they were wrong in this case. One of the quotes, and it's only quoted twice in the New Testament, the book of Job, by quotation, takes one of the things the friends threw at Job to say, in a sense, you need to know you're wrong, and Paul picks up on it to actually proclaim the truth of it. Any other text? Yeah.
Acts 3, verse 13, and it ends in verse 26.
Yeah, so the highlighted verse there that is really interesting in Acts 3 is the final one there, right? 26. God, having raised up, here's the phrase again, his servant, sent him to you first to bless you by turning every one of you from your wickedness. Great. This goes on every week in pastors' studies who are trying to do a decent job of handling an ancient text and integrating it authentically to the Christian gospel. And all of a sudden, your understanding of the text is enriched. There are ancient texts outside the family of Israel that have priestly and sacrificial-like functions, and the one who is sinned against, the righteous man, actually making others righteous. You couple that with the material within the family of Israel and all the prophetic, the priestly office, and it's all there. Your understanding of this text has been enriched. And if you choose just one of those, I usually would encourage you to think about not trying to take people to all the texts you found. This is why it actually takes reflection to allow this stuff to seep for a few days and then maybe circle at the end of the day 2 of them. One that anchors you, like Numbers 12 was a fascinating one for me, or Luke 23, and I'm not denigrating the other choices, but then you might begin to work toward the fashioning of a message where when you bring those into the sermon, it actually enriches the lives of your people. And they go away marveling at the grace of God in Christ and the coherence of how he has done that in the Scriptures. It's our conviction that the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the unifying interpretive center in all the Scriptures. And what we've been doing here is asking ourselves, how do I take one Old Testament text, relate it to one biblical theological theme, and anchor it in Israel's history and show how it anticipates what Christ has done. And when you preach that way, people are saved, relationships are restored, and the whole church begins to understand how the Bible was put together.